This video is sponsored by Shortform.
What are the factors that a student should consider before going into med school? And this person also asks, how do you know if med school is right for you?
That's such a big question. Okay. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Justin here. I'm a former medical doctor and full-time learning coach. Today we're answering questions that you have posted in the comments. We've got Arnav here behind the camera who's going to be asking me these questions. I haven't heard them before. I'll be answering them fresh.
Let's go. Shakira G asks, when you're trying to learn something, how do you find the right materials to study that subject when you're learning it outside of school, where the materials are not provided to you? There isn't like a set curriculum or course.
There are a lot of different ways, and it depends a lot on the context of what you're trying to learn. One of the ways that I would do it is find the broadest possible source of information that you can around that topic and then use that as a springboard for finding additional resources. Okay, the old school way that you would normally do this is you just find a book that kind of summarizes it, because books are usually written to be a little bit more layman friendly than like hardcore research articles. Or, I'd look for systematic reviews on a certain topic or something. But honestly, look, in the modern age today, if I was doing that now, I'm gonna chuck it in like ChatGPT or an AI. I'm just gonna ask, what are the main things I need to think about? And then recommend me some books. As long as you have a basic starting point, that's fine. One pro tip that I'd recommend though is never start with a single source. You wanna have at least 2, but up to 5 different sources of information. You want that broad reach. I mean, I feel like reluctant to say this because this video is not sponsored by Shortform, but Shortform is actually really useful for this. So you can use apps like Shortform, which tell you what other books that you can look for and all the sort of sources that you might not have thought about originally. They look at that stuff for you instead. In fact, actually, I changed my mind. This video is sponsored by Shortform. The segue was just too good. The transition was too good for me to miss. Okay, so Shortform, apps like Shortform and Shortform in particular, what they're really good at is summarizing the contents of books and then also linking it to other books that might talk about a very similar topic. I think a really, really good example of this is a book like Principles by Ray Dalio. So a book like Principles by Ray Dalio is really, really dense. The book talks about a lot of different concepts around personal development and business management and all these different things. The book itself, for those of you that have read it, actually contradicts itself inside their own book. And it also contradicts or contrasts or supplements the commentaries that other quite prolific authors talk about in related domains. What Shortform would do is it actually calls out the contradictions, and then it also provides additional context by relating it to what other books have said. So it allows you to have that springboard very efficiently. So if you want to use Shortform, then you can check the link in the description below and you get 5 days unlimited access and a discount on your annual membership, shortform.com/JustinSung.
All right, next question is a quick fire one. David A. Geraldo asks, what online whiteboard do you use?
Okay, so I have typically used an app called Concepts. This is not sponsored by Concepts. I asked Concepts to sponsor me and they refused. Actually, they don't have an affiliate program. But I normally use Concepts for my personal studying, and I use an app called Explain Everything for teaching because they have different features. But Apple has recently released Freeform, I think is the name of the app, and I haven't tested it yet, but it's looking promising. But really what I'm looking for is infinite canvas, non-linear note-taking. As long as it's got non-linear note-taking, infinite canvas, and personally, I like to make sure I'm able to draw as well, because having non-verbal expression of information is efficient if you know how to do it correctly. So those are the things that I look for. There are some apps that sort of do that, but I kind of don't recommend because the user experience is a little bit laggy and I feel that it's not so good. So prominent example would be like GoodNotes. I don't really like using GoodNotes because it's not infinite canvas. I don't have any students that continue to use GoodNotes really. They all move away from it because it's very limited. If you don't,
I dropped Notability. I used to use Notability.
Same with Notability.
Yeah.
I think people that don't drop those apps probably don't realize how much benefit infinite canvas provides. Also OneNote, purely because OneNote I feel is quite clunky to use actually. So I just don't feel like it's a great user experience. And this is like a really minor thing, but if you're doing a lot of studying, you're gonna be using this app all the time. Having a nice user experience just makes that process a lot more enjoyable. So yeah, those are the apps that I use: Concepts, Explain Everything, and I think Freeform is a great one. I know that there are other apps out there. There's not a definitive list. There's some good ones out on Windows and stuff like that as well, but It's just what I use.
What other similar apps can be used instead of Notion?
So the problem is probably that Notion is not being used in the right way. Notion is a great reference software. It's great for just putting information in that you don't need to learn as a reference source. I mostly see students using Notion as a literal note-taking tool for the purposes of helping them learn that information, but it's not very good because the relational aspects of it are very, very clunky, and the relational aspects are actually not organic. Like your brain doesn't create those relationships in the same way as Notion tracks those relationships. The representation of the information is very linear, it's very clunky, nothing about it really feels like it's designed with learning in mind, because it's not. It literally isn't. Like Notion was designed for startup entrepreneurs and people that have team flows and just personal knowledge management type things. And it's great for that. It's just not good for learning. It's just, I have beef with the fact that they started just marketing it for like students. This is the app for learning. It's like, it's kind of not from an actual cognitive science perspective. It doesn't make sense. So depending on how you're already using Notion, that makes a difference. If you are using it the way that it was intended to be used, then there are a lot of good alternatives like Obsidian, Roam Research even. I probably lean more towards Obsidian, I think is actually a better app in a lot of ways than Notion is. If you're using it just for literally like taking documents, you could use any app really. I don't use Notion anymore. I am someone that used to use Notion extensively within my business and my personal life. I actually don't use it anymore. I use a combination of Obsidian and just good old Google Docs. And then for my actual learning stuff, I have those other apps.
According to you, and as per your personal experience, what are the factors that a student should consider before going into med school? And this person also asks, how do you know if med school is right for you?
That's such a big question. Okay, factors to consider. I think the first thing is that you're probably not going to know enough about medicine before you actually do the job. I would recommend, first of all, look for alternatives as well. A lot of people get very fixed on medicine, and they don't think about the alternatives. They don't think about it realistically. Look for alternatives. Try to find reasons that you actively wouldn't like medicine. We often do that for the fields that we don't want to think about, like, oh, I know all the reasons I wouldn't want to be a lawyer, an accountant, or whatever. Do that for the ones that you feel like you do want to do as well. There's always going to be reasons. It's better to understand the reasons you wouldn't want to do something and balance and consider that realistically, because what's important is not for you to just have the security of being like, yes, I finally picked the career I want to go down. What's important is for you to make a legitimately good decision for your career. So that's one thing. The other thing I'd say is really get to know your personality. What is and is not acceptable for you? What are the non-negotiables and the negotiables in your life? You're probably not going to know that unless you have enough experience under your belt. So gain life experience, do lots of things, be involved in lots of things, start understanding where your values are, what you really need to have in your life, and then what are the things that you think you need to have, but you probably don't need to. It might not be as important as you thought it was. So very, very, very big answer. I will probably have an entire other video on this at some point anyway, but that's as concise as I can make it for now.
So this question is by Rinzler96. Justin, is there any advanced encoding technique which we can practice for technical subjects like engineering stuff?
I think to answer this, there has to be an understanding of the different types of knowledge in terms of the difference between declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, and conditional knowledge. In a very, very concise nutshell, declarative knowledge is like concepts, the knowing what. Procedural knowledge is being able to, the how, being able to do it. And conditional knowledge is knowing when it's appropriate to do it. So for something like engineering, the declarative knowledge is knowing about the concepts and formulas or whatever, depending on what type of engineering you're doing. The procedural knowledge, being able to use the right formulas in the right way, actually executing on them and using them correctly. And the conditional knowledge might be knowing what approach to use for what type of situation or application. So it depends on where the difficulty is. If you're having difficulties in understanding the concepts, then it's not really about having more advanced encoding techniques. It's more about just having good mastery and skill at whatever encoding technique that you're using. If the issue is that you're understanding it, but then forgetting it very quickly afterwards, that would still fall under issues with declarative knowledge. It probably means that the way you encoded it was too isolated. But if what the issue is not remembering the information and understanding the information, but it's applying it, especially in complex situations or out of context applications, then that's going to be more something that you can address with varied practice, interleaving at different types of mastery levels, different types of problem solving. It's a very, very big question. The short answer is no, it's probably not about having a more advanced encoding technique. It's either about a different type of technique, testing retrieval, or it's going to be about having a deeper level of skill with the more basic encoding techniques.
The next one is nice and short. It's by Blaze, and he says, how do you train yourself to do deep work?
Deep work is a very, very complicated phenomenon. And we don't really even know exactly what it is. There are a lot of theories, but one of the prevailing ones is that deep work can be trained in essentially any way that any skill or habit can be trained. Anything that's going to help to improve your focus, anything that's going to help to expose you to greater levels of immersion, figuring out what allows you to enter deep work states and then facilitating that as much as possible to gain more exposure into it. But one of the things about deep work that seems to be a recurring pattern is that it's not so much about how you can just train yourself into deep work, but it's more about how you can set up your environment or your structure in such a way that deep work becomes easier to do in the first place. What's very interesting is that research at larger scales has shown that the impact that deep work has on your productivity is almost completely overshadowed by how efficient the wider environment or system you're operating is. So if you're able to do really, really focused work in a single go, yes, that's okay in that instance. But if you're not able to create those opportunities for yourself sufficiently, it's kind of irrelevant. So it's a different type of priority. And that's actually interesting because that's kind of a slightly more recent finding. And so the shift is now that more people are focusing on how to create the structures that enable deep work to be easier. And there are less people really doubling down on how at an individual, like psychological level, you can enter into like this mythical deep work flow state so much, because it's apparently not as mythical as we had all hoped it would be. And trust me, I really hoped that it would be, magical, but it just isn't. Human brains are only so good, I guess.
Okay, cool. TY Sam says, what do you listen to while studying?
I basically only listen to white noise. Oh, I've got my laptop right here, so I can just show you really. Yeah, so I've just got this app here. Yep. But yeah, so it's just called White Noise Lite. You can also use whatever white noise app that you want. I don't like listening to music when I'm really trying to focus. There's been some research on this. Generally speaking, it feels like the research is tending towards the fact that listening to music probably doesn't help. It can help with certain types of procedural tasks that don't require like deep work, but when you really need to focus, it seems like it's not very helpful. I know that there's all this stuff around like classical music and whatever, but actually it's sort of been busted now. I listen to white noise. One thing, a pro tip, if you're gonna use white noise, try to find a white noise generator where you can adjust the type of white noise. So for example, if you are just at home, like I might just have like thunder or rain sounds, but if you're working in like a cafe or there's people talking around you, you can play like thunder or rain sounds, but you need to crank that volume up way too high to be able to drown out the speaking. So what makes more sense is that you play like cafe sounds, like people speaking, so that their sound just murmurs in, and then you play other sounds, like you could play rain on top of that. So you want to match the white noise with the distracting sound. Alternatively, if you're somewhere where there's like a lot of traffic noise, just add way more traffic noise onto that, and then some like brown or white noise on top of it.
Your brain will just drag it out.
Yeah. So the idea is that you want to make whatever is distracting you feel just homogeneous.
Francis, last name I can't pronounce, says basically if he has done mind maps to study for, what's a better way to revise for his upcoming test without redrawing the mind map?
You can do retrieval practice in many different ways, and it depends on your weaknesses. So if you have weaknesses in the lower order retrieval aspects, the simple, I'm gonna say it, flashcards are great for that. I think people feel like I'm on like a personal mission against flashcards. I'm really not, In fact, in my program, I teach people to use flashcards. I just teach to use appropriate, don't misuse it or abuse it. So if you're struggling with the lower order levels, then anything that's testing at the lower order. So flashcards, just direct retrieval, direct testing, just creating explanations, linear brain dumps. These are all great techniques. If you're struggling with mid-level application, simple past practice papers, just testing yourself, creating friend groups where you're creating questions for each other and quizzing each other based on that. You can also, and the mid to high levels, you can also take an existing mind map that you've done, and then you can also redraw it, but you don't redraw it the same way because that would be a lower order just to retrieve exactly what you had. What you can try to do is you can try to recreate the same knowledge, but in a completely different structure. So instead of creating the same mind map, you actually create a completely different mind map for the same topic, but emphasizing different networks and connections. And so that's a great one for higher level, higher order learning. That would be like a mind map, brain dump, in a form of interleaving there. So it really depends on your weaknesses. There are like hundreds of different interleaving techniques that you can use. It depends on where you see your weaknesses as being, but you really should be using a mix of all of these. And this is also a reason why you can only gain so much benefit when you're cramming really, really late, because you just simply don't have time to do all these different levels. If you're in that situation where you don't have too much time left, I would opt for that mid to high level one, because if you do the mid to high level really well, you can usually guess the lower level ones and you increase your guess rate from like 25% to like 50%. And that might be the best that you can do in the limited time you've got available. But if you don't do the high level ones, when it comes to questions that require you to have high level knowledge, you're just screwed and you lose more points that way.
Just like a personal experience I wanted to share with you. So this year, out of all my VC subjects, biology was a subject I gave up on. And what that meant was, at the end of term 3, I gave up on the subject, did not study it at home. And in class for bio, I would do other subjects. And I did a total of 3 exams for bio, like practice exams. And my initial, my proper study for my bio exam was the day after my English exam, which was the day before the bio exam. And I ended up scoring 90% on bio just by doing the mid to high. Like I just didn't study the details and I just guessed them.
Powerful. Yeah. So one of my papers when I was in medical school, I had to study basically like that because I kind of forgot that the entire paper existed. It's a long story, but anyway, yeah, it can be more effective than you realize. And yes, there's like insecurity and missing these details, but I mean, if you're in a position where you're either going to do terribly or you at least have a chance to maybe do slightly less terribly, you're going to do the best that you can.
Yeah. Like with me and that bio, my whole mentality was I just want to get majority of the marks. Like I know I didn't study, so I can't expect. But yeah, just focusing on those high level, that would have been way more beneficial and was way more beneficial than if I just memorized the facts, which a lot of my friends did.
Yeah.
Rothel Morgan says, this is a question on priming. Should you prime a couple of days before or a couple of hours before your main study session or lecture? Like what's the ideal scenario?
There's not really an ideal scenario, to be honest. If you're doing your priming at all, that's already a good thing. I guess it really depends on how much time you have. Ideally, when you're priming something, you want to be able to create a pretty good scaffold, but you want to have a good big picture understanding of the entire topic that you're studying to create lots of anchor points for relevant. If you kind of imagine like a fishing net, you want a very wide fishing net, and it can be, the gaps between the net can be very large. But when you throw it into the ocean, you're still gonna catch like a lot of those big fish. Whereas if you prime very, very small and your net is like very, very tight, but it's very small, like, yes, you'll catch like the plankton or like amoeba in the sea, but you're not really gonna be able to catch too much. That's the idea you should have for your priming. So I would always aim for as broad as possible, but very, very shallow, focusing on the concepts and the points that you feel allow your later learning to be more relevant and have more things for you to connect it to. If you've only got like 10 minutes before a lecture, you'll only be able to maybe say, okay, well, here are some of the main concepts and just get a very, very, very general gist of it. If you've got like an entire hour that you're able to spend on it the night before, you can obviously go a little bit deeper into that or a bit broader. Or if you've got an entire weekend, then you should actually study like the entire week's worth of material and prime it in advance. So it's more of a logistical decision than what is ideal, because I guess ideal is as wide as possible and as high quality as possible. It's more of a practical constraint.
Leo says, Hi Justin, is it okay to begin with writing linear notes for concepts that we understand if we're not yet proficient in other forms of more effective note-taking?
Okay, I like this question because it's recognizing that there are more effective forms. Okay, but with any learning technique, it's always okay to start with where you're comfortable and then gradually transition to the forms that are more advanced. You don't want to ever, and I see this in my program all the time because we teach so many techniques in a short period of time. People are like, oh, I'm just gonna like scrap my entire system and then build an entire new one from scratch. And it's inevitably gonna fail because it's just too many things to keep track of. You'll be spending so much time trying to do the right technique that you won't have any cognitive resources left to actually think about the literal thing that you're meant to be learning. So it's kind of like when you're trying to read very quickly. So you're so focused on reading fast that you don't actually have enough reserve to process and interpret the information. Always start with where you're comfortable and just push that limit step by step by step. You can start with linear. You can then start to process little parts of it. The typical progression that I introduce in my program is if you're really struggling to go from linear to non-linear, then you do a crutch step in between where you basically have part of it linear and then you process and make it as non-linear as possible piece by piece. And then you eventually get to the point where the non-linear parts become default and you can just completely drop the linear aspects of it. So there's a series of transitions you can go through.
Alberto says that firstly, he's a very big fan of yours. And secondly, he's really struggling with calculus and trying to apply your methods to math because he feels like that's a bit different. So basically, could you provide him with some advice on how he can study math effectively?
Okay, two things. The first thing is that math has a lot of procedural components to it, procedural and conditional components to it. So a big part of maths will be dependent on being able to do good interleaved retrieval. So having the problem solving, being able to use the rules and the equations and things correctly, and then knowing in what situations to use that. Okay. However, there's another big part that's challenging for maths is that maths is typically taught with only a procedural and conditional focus. The declarative aspects of maths are often either not taught at all or like very, very, very understated. But if you go, like literally just like go on YouTube and like listen to these math prodigies and established professors of mathematics talk about the best way to learn maths, they all say that before you learn how to use the equation formulas, you should understand in words what it is that you're learning and why you're learning it. The difficulty is that when you first receive the information, when it's taught to you in a way that is far removed from that level of conceptual understanding. And that's where the effort comes in. But again, in the modern era, you can literally just ask an AI bot, like, I'm learning this topic. Tell me why it is relevant and important and what are the other connections and concepts that it's related to. Build that non-numerical, like verbal understanding about what you're learning, why you're learning it, how it's connected, how it's relevant. Spend a bit of time doing that. And what you'll find is that, the equations and things that, you still have to do the procedural parts, but when you go to solve problems, you'll have a better idea about what approach you can use. I see this often in, like mostly in secondary school. I don't see it so much in people that are doing like math majors at university. A common approach to solving questions in maths is you kind of just span all the different formulas that you think will fit, and you just find the one where like it just fits. Like, oh, there's this letter here and I see this letter here as well. Like I'm just gonna use every possible, and that's why there's so many instances where there might be one formula that has a specific letter, but it's like lowercase compared to like an uppercase, but they don't realize that's actually like a different concept completely. A big part of being able to solve complex problems, like a lot of stuff in calculus, is understanding conceptually how to approach the problem before you even think about the numbers and the formulas as part of it. I'm not an expert mathematician, but I teach expert mathematicians and they say this works great. So,
Last question for the video, and it's by Snippets. He says, how do you know when cognitive load isn't just you being tired? Like, how do you find that balance between you knowing that you're tired and that this is not you being tired, it's actually your cognitive load?
I think it should be fairly straightforward to know the difference between the two. So that probably comes around from not understanding where the cognitive load is meant to come from. A misunderstanding with cognitive load is that what we're trying to do when we're learning effectively is not directly increase the cognitive load. Like that's not the point. If our point was to just increase cognitive load, we would like study, like balancing on a ball with like one eye closed, having our friend like slap us in the face while we're studying. But that's not the point. The point is to engage in the right type of thinking process, and that right type of thinking process naturally involves more like mental exertion, which is perceived as cognitive load. The cognitive load is an indicator of the process. When you're mentally tired, the cognitive load is not increasing, right? So if you imagine you're like working out, the weights are not getting heavier as you are getting tired. What's changing is your ability to tolerate that exertion. And that may seem quite nuanced, but it's actually a very different sensation. When you're using the right type of cognitive load, right type of process, and you feel the good cognitive load, then you know that you're trying to do this back and forth comparative learning. You're using those higher order learning principles that I talk about in all my other videos. We're constantly going back and forth, and there is this idea that I'm in control and engaged with this learning. I'm forming this network and schema of knowledge. And that's where our attention and our brain power is. Whereas if we're trying to do that, but we're tired, we're still trying to do that, but we'd find that we're not able to do it for as much information, or it's taking us longer to find those relationships and build those networks and build those structures. So you'd still understand that the form is correct. You would just feel that you're not able to tolerate it and just keep going with it for as long. So it's quite a different sort of sensation. Great, so thanks for your attention and going through these Q&As. If you've got questions of your own, then you can either leave them in comments, or what we actually introduced is a subreddit. So you can go to Reddit. The subreddit is called Dr. Justin Sung. And what we'll be doing is we'll be using that as a platform to have a little bit more conversational engagement. You'll be able to ask some questions, and we'll be going through the subreddit and reacting and answering questions from there, because it's a little bit hard to just trawl through like hundreds of YouTube comments to find all of these comments, and the upvote system in Reddit is actually very handy for that. So we've set that up. You can feel free to check it out. The link's in the description, and we'll do another one of these Q&A videos very shortly. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.